Welcome to part 2 of SGI's Mesic habitat conservation video. My name is Jeremy Myostis. I'm with the NRCS, and I'm introducing our speaker for this segment. Patrick Donnelly is a landscape ecologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service's Intermountain West joint venture based in Missoula, Montana. And Patrick will be talking to us about mapping Mesic resources.
Thanks, Jeremy, for the introduction. So this is Patrick Donnelly talking. I wanted to continue the discussion that Jeremy started with some of the Mesic data and how we've created over time and what it means for the users in the future. Jeremy mentioned earlier a project that I've led in parts of Oregon, California, Nevada that looked at distribution of grouse and related those distributions back to these broad-scale patterns in Mesic. The original footprint of that study you're seeing on your screen right now, since that time in 2016, we expanded that project to include the entire range of grouse. Now we did this for a couple of reasons. First being, we wanted to extend the analysis we'd begun previously in Oregon, which is forthcoming. And we also wanted to extend that data set that we developed for Oregon to all of the conservation groups across the West, so those groups could take that information we're using to inform science and apply it to conservation planning to create better targeted resource outcomes for Mesic and grouse across the entire West. So what I'm going to do is talk first about what the data actually really is and talk about some caveats, how we produced it to give folks a better idea of how they can apply it to address their own local scale questions. So I'm going to begin the talk with looking at a landscape in the Great Basin. And so the Great Basin is unique in grouse that we have topographic relief, montane portions of the range, which include high elevation Mesic sites that Jeremy discussed in his presentation, as well as some of these lower elevation Mesic resources tied to riparian features and land use practices typically associated with ranching across the West. In this view, I can also add leks for reference. So we think of leks as that continuous constellation of sage grouse. Leks are things that don't move very much. They're representative of bird distributions and abundance. And so we first thought about relating Mesic back to these constellation of sage grouse. We thought, well, shoot, we can go out. We can map Mesic like you see on your screen right now is these green areas. And we can relate these individual patches of Mesic back to sage grouse locations, i.e. lek locations. Well, we did this for 1 year. We thought, we need to look at these things through time because things tied back to water, which Mesic resources are, remembering that Mesic resource in the context of sage grouse are those things that stay green in late summer from, say, mid-July to the latter part of September and October, depending on where you're at in the range. And so this is one representation of that late season Mesic abundance. And we can see these upper elevation montane systems occurring here, as well as up here in the northeast portion of the image. And we can see the broad riparian resources tied to those same bottomlands occurring throughout the image as well. And so this is 1 year, one slice of data that we actually examined. Now, we said, okay, let's look at the second year. And so we looked at the second year, and the picture looks starkly different. So all that green Mesic we saw in year 1 went away. So we thought, wow, these things are really much more dynamic than we actually thought they might be. And so to understand this relationship between grouse distribution and Mesic resource function, we need to measure things through time and space. And so when you think about this Mesic resource data set, think of it as a spatial temporal data set. So each year we look at the changing abundance and distribution of Mesic resource through time and space. And so that gives you the ability to rewind to look at dry years, to fast forward to look at wet years, and everything in between. It gives you that trend in how these things fluctuate through time. But we asked the question, well, what was the real driver behind these resources? And so we know water and climate in the West is a huge kind of coupled component of how plants and range and wetlands respond. And so this graph you see across the x-axis from 1984 here on the far left over to 2016 on the far right are years. This line across the center says 100%. That line is our mean precipitation, our mean snow water equivalent. So what I'm going to show you now is actually data from different snowtail sites from portions of the West. You can see them being mapped out in the graph here. What you notice, there's a lot of up and down movement. Now, this gets kind of messy, so I'm just going to fast forward to the end here and draw a mean of all these snowtail, water, snowpack, precipitation, everything packed into 1 year equivalents. And what we see is that normal is stochasticity. There is really no normal across the West. We're always bouncing around between above average to deeply below average. Now, that first picture I showed you in the Great Basin showed all the Mesic resource. That was taken in 1996. Second year of a wet trend across the West. Lots of green going on out there. The second picture I showed you, that dry portion, was taken in 1992, the last year of a prolonged drought, which dried up much of that Mesic resource and sucked out all that resiliency and the stored water in the soil and made all that late season Mesic resource for grouse evaporate. So now that we kind of understand we've got this spatial temporal data set, we know there's this driver of annual precipitation that is creating this pattern of stochasticity across the range. Let's look to see what it actually means for grouse and Mesic. So we're back to our scene, or nearly our scene. We're actually zoomed out a little bit further here that we examined earlier. Here's that area of upper montane Mesic resource, and here's those riparian features I showed you earlier in the previous image. Now, you see some different colors across these Mesic sites here. We see our Lex. The greener the color, the higher the productivity. So these upper montane sites up here, as well as these riparian bottoms, have high rates of productivity. As we get to lighter green shades, we're seeing still productive sites, but they're not as productive. As we scale down to yellows and reds, we're actually seeing sites that are unproductive, meaning they're so dry, they don't have any real Mesic resource, or that green grocery store that Jeremy talked about earlier, it's not open, it's closed. And so if we want to talk about what this looks like through time and space, we can actually go in and play a movie. And we're going to start that movie. And you can see up here in 1984 is when it's going to begin. And watch this changing time of year as you see these colors across the entire screen flash different reds, greens, yellows. So here we go, beginning in 1984. And what you see is we cycle through years of drought, of high water abundance. There's a lot of changing going on in the distribution and abundance of those resources. I'll play it again. And it really is the spatial temporal dynamics that we need to understand relative to grouse, but also to make those decisions on the ground for where we look at conservation actions of conservation and restoration practices occurring across these broader landscapes. And so the question people often have now is, well, okay, I love the data. I understand I might be able to use it, but how do you actually create it? Tell me more about the creation of the information. So the great thing we have, or we had insight to begin collecting in 1984, was Landsat Thematic Mapper satellite imagery. That was launched as Landsat 4 satellite. There's a different series of numbers, 4 through 8. We're on Landsat 8 now. What they are a series of satellites that orbit the Earth in what we call geosynchronous orbit. So geosynchronous means that over a certain period of time they pass over the same exact spot, the same exact time of day, and they snap a picture. So that geosynchronous rate for Landsat is 16 days. So every 16 days, that satellite comes across the planet, takes a picture, a square picture, It downloads that back to the Earth, and we have this incredible archive of data from 1984 to present to access. And so we were able to access all this data, and by the way, it's made available and it's free for folks to use to build our models from. Now, we didn't use all of the Landsat data over the sage-grouse range because we were interested in late brood rearing in the context of Mesic resource. We looked at periods from July 15th to September 30th. And for each year, we averaged all the Landsat data that occurred within that time frame to develop some rate or measure what we call productivity or Mesic productivity. I'll talk more about what that actually means in a moment. But it's from this Landsat data set that we derived all of our information from. Now, we're going to go back to our previous Great Basin example. And what we're going to do, we look at these green areas and we go, okay, I saw a lot more detail just previously when you're showing me that flashing, screen from year to year looking at changes in Mesic productivity. But now I see it green. So let's look closer at this by going up to this northeast corner of that red box and zoom into these individual Mesic resources. And we see when we get closer, there are actually objects inside of those green areas or polygons. And so what we did was we took all the satellite data and we looked at the data and we said we need to figure out a way to actually just extract those areas which are Mesic resources. So we have an analysis we use called a clustering type of analysis. And what that clustering analysis does, it looks at all the Landsat imagery and it begins to group these small elements in the imagery we call pixels into smaller little clusters. And those little clusters are represented by what we might think of as ecological gradients. So it might be the gradient boundary between a stream floodplain and an upland might be a boundary which I cluster pixels for the stream bottom on one side and the upland on the other. And then I draw a polygon around those. So remember back in the old days when I think folks used to go in and hand digitize and outline wetland features? Well, think of this as a way of automating that entire process. We don't hand digitize things anymore. We use clustering analysis, and we build ecological objects out of those different clusters. And so to reemphasize that point of what these ecological gradients and polygons look like, let's look at the same landscape using a high-resolution aerial photo. And so in this photo, we're seeing the same riparian bottom right here. Okay, so this is that hay meadow we're seeing right here. We're seeing some of these more upland sagebrush montane systems here. We're seeing more riparian bottom down here on the left side of the image. Now I'm going to turn on our ecological objects, we might think of them as, and see how they actually capture the extent that we can visualize in this high-resolution data set. And so here's that stream channel where it looks like it's very green and wet. So it captures that inner channel pretty well and says, okay, I'm in the floodplain, but there's a greener part of the floodplain right here I'm going to capture, but I'm also going to capture this floodplain just next to it, which might be a little bit drier. Maybe it dries out sooner. It's only wet every 3 of 10 years instead of every year, like the center part of the stream here. We see that same discrete pattern down here in the lower floodplain where we capture that inner floodplain where it's always green, as well as these little less Mesic sites occurring within the floodplain, but adjacent to the main channel where that water actually is. So discrete features, riparian. Now, if you look at these montane sagebrush systems, we see different shapes and patterns. So as we go up slope, when we think about the drivers for Mesic resources at these elevations, we start thinking about slope and aspect. And so slope and aspect typically occurs in these larger, blockier type of ecological footprints because the slope is not linear like a stream. They're kind of blockier and flatter and rounder, say like these shapes that are represented up here. So these are individual ecological units that are similar in their Mesic response, but they're defined more by that pattern of slope and aspect that we see at higher elevations that drive Mesic resources in these locations. And so That's that kind of object we use to differentiate and extract those Mesic features from the broader landscape. Now this gave us a couple of different advantages. The main one is when we extract features like this, we did it continuously across the entire range of grouse, and then we filtered and only selected certain objects out that we wanted to use. When we did this, we could eliminate things like forested systems, which may have a response that looks Mesic. It's not, it's just really green because we have coniferous tree canopy covers that give us a false positive. But grouse don't like trees, so we eliminate all those polygons. We can also eliminate areas that are never green, that never provide any late season Mesic resources like uplands that are always, always dry across our 30-year time period. And we can eliminate things like crops. Some crops we did include like alfalfa. Other crops like cereal grains, like in eastern Montana, where they're actually a driver of landscape fragmentation and not a benefit to grouse, we eliminated. If you look closely at the data too, you might see some straight lines in here. And you're saying, well, what kind of ecological gradient is that? I said, well, it's not really an ecological gradient. That's actually an ownership line. And so once we developed all of our ecological gradients and our objects that were Mesic, we intersected that data with ownership. And so one side of this line is public and one side is private. And so when we developed our models, what we're doing is actually averaging the amount of Mesic abundance or response inside of these individual polygons. And we wanted to have the ability to segment that response between public and private lands or ownership. And so the straight lines you see are those ownership lines we intersected across those ecological gradients to better parse out and look at our data. And we expect this will provide additional insight to planners on the ground, which may be working solely on public lands or solely on private lands, to help parse out and understand how things are changing on their projects through time and space. So the next thing I want to kind of talk about is how we actually make those measurements of productivity using satellite data. So let me talk about this screen here in just a second, but pay attention here. We're going to talk a little bit about solar radiation. And so think of the sun blasting the earth with all the solar radiation as light. So it's leaving the sun, it's traveling through space, hitting the earth. It hits the atmosphere, and it hits the ozone, and it bounces around the atmosphere through water vapor and CO2, and it hits the surface of the earth. In this case, it's hitting a surface of a leaf. And it reflects off that surface and bounces back up into space. And that satellite that's orbiting the Earth, remember every 16 days we have a geosynchronous orbit with Landsat data. It's capturing that spectral imagery, that light reflected from the Earth traveling from the sun. And depending upon the type of surface it's reflecting, we know how different surfaces react to that wavelight energy, what they reflect back into space and captured by the satellite. And so in this case, we're looking at a leaf example. And now, the satellite sees a bunch of different light that human eyes can't see. And so you see here under healthy leaf on the far right, it says NIR, that's for near infrared energy. So healthy leaves that are green, that have that nice, they have moisture in the soil, they're happy, they're making lots of sugar, they're photosynthesizing, they have a high reflectance in the near IR, okay? They also have a ratio between how much they reflect in the near IR and how much they reflect in the red band, the red color portion of the light coming off the Earth. They also reflect a lot of green light. And so because we can see green light, that's why we see plants as green when they're healthy. We just can't see this near infrared portion of it. So as we understand these different proportions of light energy reflected from leaves that are now measured by satellites, we can see that once we move to the stressed leaf, those ratios between near infrared and red begin to change. And so as they change from stress down to dead, we can actually measure these changes as a rate of changing productivity through time and space if we have multiple images of Landsat imagery over that same area. We measure this using a derivative of these spectral responses that we just talked about. And it's called, you've probably heard of it, it's called NDVI. NDVI stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. So I'm not going to show the equation, but basically we take ratios of that near-infrared light energy and the red portion of the spectrum, and we develop an index with the image. And the index on the image, if you can picture an image of a picture of the Earth, and a grayscale image that goes from these values, sometimes that image is, in some places, is down to -1, and sometimes it can be all the way up to +1. That's the range of NDVI. So think of 1 as something so green it hurts to look at, like the tropical rainforest along the equator in Brazil. As we get to 0, you might think of something more like Mojave Desert, very little grass, middle of the summer, nothing green at all, lots of soil, not a lot of NDVI going on. And the -1 are actually areas that absorb a lot of near-infrared radiation. Like, think of something like a deep water body, like Crater Lake, would be the -1 for NDVI. But let's put this in context of grouse and the project we worked on with mapping Mesic resource. So I'm going to leave the Great Basin. I'm going to go to Pinedale, Wyoming. So last year I was flying around Pinedale. It was September 10th. I took this picture. And I thought it was a nice example of how we might think of gradations of NDVI and how we might interpret them relative to the scale of -1 to 1. And so if I think of low NDVI, I'm thinking upland. I'm thinking late summer, very dry. I'm up in the sagebrush. There's no green. There's no forbs. They're all dead. Our level of there's no bugs up there, so not a lot of insects going on. If I'm a chicken and a hen, I'm probably not hanging out up here too much as far as getting food. Now I can see there's this bench up here, this disconnected oxbow in the floodplain. It's got a little green in it. It's not super green. And I can think of this as kind of some moderate level NDVI. Maybe this guy right here is probably like a 0.2 or 0.3 NDVI, somewhere up in here. This low guy is probably around 0.1. And so I've got a little greener, I've got a little closer to where the water is. I'm going to get a little bit closer. I'm going to drop down here to this riparian bottom. I'm closest to that groundwater level. And down here I might think of something as a high NDVI rate. Maybe high is more over here on this side of the image. But you follow me that there's these different levels of NDVI relative to greenness. This guy might be above a 0.3. Now, I mentioned 0.3 as a threshold I'd like to talk about quite a bit, because in the work that we've done in Oregon and the expanded NDVI or Mesic model we've developed across the entire West, we considered that threshold of 0.3 an important threshold to cross. If you're one of those ecological objects or polygons I talked about in the previous slide, and your average NDVI response inside of that individual polygon was greater than a 0.3, we considered you green enough for grouse actually to access and utilize the resource. If you fell below that 0.3 threshold, we counted you as unavailable and very dry and not available for grouse to utilize. And so that's our subjective, it is founded in some actual observation, but you can understand as we expand it across the entire West, there is some subjectivity. But that 0.3 becomes very important to consider in how we interpret what's available for grouse and what's not available for grouse across the West. There's one thing else I'd like to talk to folks about, and this is this whole idea of scale and the top-down modeling approach that we developed with the Mesic model. Now, in the opening part of this discussion, I did mention, the reason for expanding this Mesic model is twofold. One, to inform research, so we understand those patterns we measure in Oregon and how they occur across the entire range of grouse in some forthcoming research. The second is to provide a tool for practitioners to make better decisions and target resource outcomes in a more efficient way. So this is that big top-down approach colliding with the practitioner's typically bottom-up approach. And let's frame this in the context of Landsat data. So we've left Pinedale, and now we're in Montana, in eastern Montana, north of Roundup. And this is actually a Landsat image. We can view this riparian bottom going through the image pretty well. We can see drainages. We can see these forested montane systems. We can see cropland going down here. Pretty clear system. If I'm in a plane flying at 30,000 feet, I'm thinking, all right, pretty good view. But let's zoom in a little bit closer. So a little closer, now we're flying about 20,000 feet. Still things look pretty clear, maybe a little bit blurry now. A little bit closer, now I'm seeing a little bit of pixelation going on, meaning these things are starting to not look more fuzzy. As I get closer with Landsat data, the pixelation becomes even more apparent. I get even closer. This is the nearsightedness that Landsat has. And so when we talk about this top-down approach with measuring landscape change through time and using Landsat, remember that Landsat sees the world in 30 by 30 meter grid cells, or pixels. So that's about the size of a baseball diamond, right? It's not really small, it's not really big, but it can help eliminate some of those details that you or I, as a practitioner on the ground, if doing some planning, might see otherwise. And so here's that very pixelated near-side view of Landsat we have to consider. This view is the view that you or I on the ground during planning see. We can see individual sagebrush. We can see those meanders very clearly across that riparian corridor. We can see this small Mesic area up here, this little kind of sliver of a drainage going on up here. Landsat sees this. And so what it sees still very well is this bottom riparian drainage. It doesn't quite see this very sliver of a Mesic resource occurring in the upper right-hand corner of the imagery. So be aware that there is a balance between what you see on the ground from that bottom-up approach as a practitioner and that very broad-scale, top-down Mesic resource data set. The trick there is to marry the two at the right scale so it can get you close to where you want to be, and then you rely on your local knowledge to make things perfect on the ground for your conservation planning. Oftentimes, data sets like the Mesic resource set get criticized for being inaccurate or not valuable. Oftentimes, it's not so much that they're inaccurate or invaluable, it's just they're being applied beyond the scope of their intended use. And so we want users to be aware of those intended uses. We're not telling you how or how not to use the data, just to be aware of some potential limitations. Also be aware that this data set is one that is a living data set. So we anticipate as it rolls out and we get feedback coming back in, we're going to make improvements to the data as those things happen. And think of it as a living data set in the context of updates. And so because of the framework we've built to develop this data set, we'll be updating annually a different new set of data for a new year as we acquire new Landsat imagery. So as we go through 2017 and 2018 and 2019, for each of those years, year by year, we'll be updating this data set with a new set of data, allowing you to track changes in climate-driven variability, as well as changes in outcomes and restoration response in some of your sites. We have tested this data set over some areas we know where restoration has occurred, and given different scales and properties of the data, we do see potential linkages back to a monitoring capability. Depending on how small and where your stuff is, there may be some limitations, but in a broader general sense, we can see some of those changes we're seeing on the ground through time restoration. I want to leave you guys now with a talk with Brady Allred. So Brady's going to talk about how you access all this data through a web application that's interactive, and he's going to take you through those processes to take it from scientific data to planning next. So Brady, take it away.